Welcome, everybody. My name is Dolly Edmonds, and I am the Director of Policy and Outreach for Audubon Rockies. We are so glad that you're joining us tonight for this one-hour webinar titled Colorado's Energy Future, Making Sure Wildlife is Protected. This online presentation is being recorded. To reduce background noise, all participants are muted. And we have people participating using two different formats. One is directly as a participant on Zoom, and the also is via Audubon Rockies Facebook Live feature. Three colleagues are helping me to run this presentation. Zach Hutchinson, also with Audubon Rockies, is managing the Facebook aspect. Bo Kickless with Conservation Colorado will be wrapping up our presentation at the end. And Ian Roach, also with Conservation Colorado, will be helping me facilitate the Q&A session at the end. As a participant, we encourage you to ask questions of our panelists. How you do so is going to depend on how you're viewing this presentation. If it's by Zoom, type your question into the chat box, which is located at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see it, move your mouse to the bottom of your screen and the chat box should appear. Click on it and type your question directly into that. If you're participating via Facebook Live, please post your questions in the comment section. And again, Zach will be making sure that we find out about those questions. Next. And due to technology, there may be a slight delay in the slides, so appreciate everyone kind of bearing with us on this. Because this is a complicated issue, we have created a 3-page document which provides background and guidance on how to make your voice heard. If you registered for this event with an organization, you'll receive this document, perhaps you already have, or directly after this webinar within a week. If you're not sure, you are welcome to type in your first and last name and email address into the chat box or comment section. Next. We also want to recognize the very many organizations that are actively engaged on this issue. Chances are if you heard about this webinar either through one or more of these organizations. And as you'll hear from our panelists today, Bob Randall and Nada Culver, we are in a really unique position at this moment in time to help determine the future for Colorado's wildlife and our outdoor heritage. So thank you very much for setting aside an hour of your evening to learn about this issue and how you can make a difference. So let's get started. Our very first presenter next is Bob Randall. He is the former executive director of the Department of Natural Resources and was involved in the 2008 oil and gas rulemaking overhaul. So brings with him a whole lot of experience. Thank you so much, Bob.
Thanks, Dolly. Good evening, everyone. I'll echo her thank you for taking time out of your evening to join us here to learn about what's going on with regard to oil and gas and wildlife in Colorado. It's my privilege really to be a part of this effort. I'm representing a coalition of 4 different organizations in the rulemaking that's underway at the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission that we'll be talking about. Those groups are the Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, Colorado Trout Unlimited, Colorado Wildlife Federation, and the National Wildlife Federation. So these organizations are parties to the rulemaking. Next slide, please, Nada. I'll be covering just a handful of things tonight. I've got about 15 minutes with you. I'll talk about just an overview of oil and gas development in Colorado, set the stage a little bit. I'll talk about the history of oil and gas oversight, and especially those provisions to protect wildlife. I'll talk about legislative changes in 2019. This is Senate Bill 181 that many of you might have heard about before, and then talk about where we are with the oil and gas rulemaking that's underway at the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission. Next slide, please. So this is a map of Colorado with just a couple of pieces of information on it. You can see the counties outlined there. The blue polygons are the major oil and gas producing basins in Colorado, and the red dots are active oil and gas wells in Colorado. You see the concentration in the northeast portion of the state, that's largely in Weld County. A lot of historic development in the southern portion of the state, the San Juan Basin in the southwest, and the Raton Basin in sort of southeast, south central. And then in northwest Colorado is the Piceance Basin, and a lot of development there, primarily for natural gas. Not as much active drilling these days due to the price of natural gas as compared to oil. But this is just to give you a sense of where the activity occurs and where impacts to wildlife might take place. Next slide. Colorado is the leading national producer of oil and gas. As of January, we were ranked 5th for oil production nationally and 6th for gas production. There are over 52,000 active oil and gas wells. There are 421 registered oil and gas operators in the state. And my note there is that 40 companies control about or account for about 90% of the wells in the state. As for the level of permitting and development activity, the Oil and Gas Commission approves about 2,000 new well permits and about 225 permits for new pads or new locations. Next slide. Just a quick history of oil and gas oversight in Colorado. Like many states, Colorado has an Oil and Gas Conservation Act. It was passed in 1963. It is focused on the orderly development of oil and gas resources and the prevention of waste and not stranding oil and gas underground. It has not historically been focused on surface impacts, and it's been more focused on engineering, orderly development, and those sorts of issues. It has been changed over the years, so I don't want to give the impression that it's never been changed. But major changes were made in 2007. The Habitat Stewardship Act. This was, for those of you who maybe have been involved, this was House Bill 1298 in 2007. Was one of Governor Ritter's first acts as governor. When he was on the campaign trail, he heard, as he traveled around the state, he heard a lot about oil and gas's impacts on wildlife and wildlife habitat, especially in Northwest Colorado. And so he supported and signed into law the Habitat Stewardship Act of 2007. It directed the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. So that's the regulatory body. It's within the Department of Natural Resources, but they are charged with the oversight of oil and gas development in the state. It directed the Oil and Gas Commission to balance development of the oil and gas resources of Colorado with conservation of the wildlife resources of the state. It enshrined the mitigation hierarchy. Again, many of you are probably familiar with that, but it directs operators first to avoid impacts to wildlife resources. For those impacts that can't be avoided, they are to minimize those impacts. And then third, they are to mitigate any remaining impacts that can't be avoided or minimized. It involved, at the time, the Division of Wildlife, now Colorado Parks and Wildlife, for the first time in decision-making on oil and gas formally, by calling for a process that leads to a timely and efficient consultation between Colorado Parks and Wildlife, the surface owner, the operator, and the Oil and Gas Commission, where wildlife are likely to be impacted. And it imposed a couple of standards for decision-making under the Act. One is that provisions for wildlife protection were required to be cost-effective and technically feasible. Those are not especially burdensome standards. However, they did provide a real opportunity for companies or trade organizations to argue that provisions for the protection or to minimize impacts on wildlife weren't cost effective or would cost too much or were difficult to implement. So again, that was in the statute in 2007. And then another condition is that the oil and gas rules that resulted out of the Habitat Stewardship Act set a few statewide standards for wildlife protection. And I can talk about those in a second, but things like wildlife-friendly fence or wildlife-friendly seed mixes or weed control. It did allow the Oil and Gas Commission to attach permit-specific conditions for wildlife protection that come out of the consultation with state wildlife officials. And so CPW could suggest different measures to minimize impacts on wildlife from a particular location, but it required that a surface owner provide her or his consent for any permit-specific conditions of approval for the benefit of wildlife. So I really just kind of wanted to frame the Habitat Stewardship Act in that way. Again, it was the first time that wildlife was brought into the conversation when it comes to oil and gas development, largely as a result of the expansion of oil and gas into the northwest part of the state in the Piceance Basin. So that act was passed in 2007. In the next year, actually it was about an 18-month process, the Oil and Gas Commission undertook a major overhaul of its rules to address House Bill 1298 and a companion piece of legislation that called for reconsideration of impacts on public health, safety, and welfare. That was House Bill 1341. But the Oil and Gas Commission undertook a major rulemaking to implement those bills. It led to a couple of things that I just wanted to note. One is the designation of sensitive wildlife habitat and restricted surface occupancy areas. So these are maintained to this day on the Oil and Gas Commission's website. An operator proposing activities in designated sensitive wildlife habitat is required to consult with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. They have 40 days to do so, where CPW can suggest conditions. Restricted surface occupancy areas tend to be much smaller areas around specific occurrences of a species. So nests, leks, severe winter range areas, really much smaller areas, and operators are directed to stay out of those areas so long as it's cost effective and technically feasible for them to do so. Again, it set some operating standards for wildlife protection. Operators can't leave trenches open for an inordinate amount of time or need to have escape ramps for wildlife. They need to net their pits to prevent birds from landing on pits that might contain materials that would be harmful. So there's some operating standards set out in the Oil and Gas Commission's rules that were adopted in 2008 for wildlife protection. Next slide, please. So this brings us up to the present, or very nearly to the present. And these are this is the legislative change that I referenced earlier, a bill that passed last year. So this is Senate Bill 181. I'm going to focus on the wildlife provisions of Senate Bill 181. I don't want to ignore the fact that Senate Bill 181 made many, many changes to the way oil and gas oversight will occur in the state. It also addresses things like local government decision-making as to where development can occur. It calls for rulemaking on financial assurance and bonding. It addresses flow lines and wellbore integrity and lots of things that are, in addition to the wildlife provisions. Particular as to wildlife, though, it does change the Oil and Gas Commission's mission. And this is set out in the Oil and Gas Conservation Act. The mission was to foster oil and gas development in a manner that is consistent with protection of public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources. That has been changed now to say that the oil and gas mission is to regulate oil and gas activity in a manner that protects public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources. And so that's, it's changing a few words of the statute, but it really does affect everything that the Oil and Gas Commission does and will do into the future. And so when we talk about this rulemaking, we'll often talk about it being the mission change rulemaking, because that change in the mission is so fundamental to what the OGCC does. As to wildlife, it authorizes the COGCC to require compensatory mitigation to address impacts that can't be avoided or minimized. That's a new provision. Again, it was mitigation was referenced in the prior law, but compensatory mitigation wasn't specifically authorized. It eliminates some of the constraints that I mentioned before on wildlife protection. It eliminates the requirement that wildlife measures be cost-effective and technically feasible. They are required in the statute to be reasonable, but it eliminates some of the arguments that have been made against wildlife measures in the past. And then it narrows the types of issues for which surface owner consent is required. Surface owner consent on permit-specific conditions for wildlife is only needed where the protections directly impact the property or its use by the surface owner. The bill also requires protection of biological resources. This is again, a new provision. And then it calls for the analysis of a couple of things that I'll touch on. One is the analysis of alternative locations, and the other is cumulative impacts. And the rationale behind these is that you can't know that you are minimizing impacts on wildlife or any other resource, really, unless you've looked at alternatives to a proposed site and assessed how those, what the likely foreseeable impacts for those locations would be. And then as to cumulative impacts, with wildlife, I think it is especially important because wildlife are affected by a lot of different activities that are occurring on the ground, not just oil and gas development. And so, again, the statute directs the Oil and Gas Commission to ensure an alternative location analysis process and a way to analyze cumulative impacts. Next slide. So now this brings us up to current day. The Oil and Gas Conservation Commission is in the midst of a rulemaking to affect the mission change. Again, that rulemaking addresses many, many topics, including wildlife. There are some opportunities that I think Bo will touch on in a little while, but they're accepting public comment. You can submit written comments to the email address that's on your screen. There will be an opportunity to submit oral comments to the commissioners at the beginning of their hearings on the different rule series, one on August 24th and one on September 28th. Oral comments you'll need to register in advance. There will be a link on the Cogcc's website in the week before that. There are public hearings to occur to affect the mission change. In August to October, these will be virtual rulemaking hearings done via Zoom. I just kind of highlighted a couple of the rule series. The permitting rules, these are the 300 series rules of the Commission. The hearing on those will be August 24th to September 10th. The rulemaking hearing during those dates will address a lot of other topics, but again, permitting is where cumulative impacts, alternative locations, wildlife planning, and things like that will be addressed. And then the wildlife rules, the 1200 series rules of the OGCC will be considered in a hearing September 28th to October 9th. Again, I put there that more details are available on request. I'm more than happy to share more information about the different rulemakings or the different provisions that will be addressed in those rulemakings. So that is what I'd like to share on kind of the process and how we got here. It's my pleasure now. I guess we're going to take some questions at the end of our thing, although I'm seeing that there are a couple of questions that are coming in through the chat. I think it's probably cleanest to address those when we're finished, but keep the questions coming, please. It's my pleasure now to introduce our next speaker, and that is Neda Culver. Neda is the Vice President for Public Lands and Senior Policy Counsel for the National Audubon Society. Neda has been working on and is an expert on public lands issues and oil and gas. She's been doing that for more than a decade. And will bring a great perspective to the discussion tonight. So Neda, you're up.
Thanks, Bob. Hoping I can talk and make the PowerPoint work at the same time, but so far it's not letting me. Hope. It's going so well. Okay. So following up on Bob's description of the process we're looking at of how the rules affect wildlife, we thought it would be helpful to circle back on exactly how the rules could be protecting wildlife, what's good about them, but what else they could do to be better. So you'll see this kind of split thing of why we like the rules and what else could be done, again, to protect wildlife, focusing on just that tonight. So we're going to highlight, I think, 4 or 5 different parts of the rules that are really key to how wildlife can be protected. And the first one, which Bob mentioned, all of these and some others, so we can come back to others in the questions, is consultation. And this is really the way that Colorado Parks and Wildlife is required to be involved. And this is, one of the most important things that we can support, because Colorado Parks and Wildlife is the expert on wildlife and has this opportunity to make recommendations to the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission and to the director. So the flow here is Colorado Parks and Wildlife takes its good ideas, and hopefully many of all of our good ideas, makes some recommendations to the director, and then the director will make recommendations to the commission, who will make the final decision. So the more we can ensure that voices are heard focused on wildlife, the more likely it is that those recommendations get adopted and that wildlife is getting the attention it deserves. So that's why we keep talking about consultation. Obviously, consultation doesn't mean direction, it's different. The final decision is not with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, but the theme you'll see in what Bob highlighted and what I'm highlighting and what we're asking you all to do in engaging is to make sure that that input is required, permitted, emphasized, and so forth. So the two big ways that Colorado Parks and Wildlife gets to engage in consultation is first, they can recommend that the commission deny approval altogether of plans based on reasonably foreseeable risks to wildlife resources that can't be sufficiently addressed. Again, the commission makes the final decision, but this is a really important change in the regulations writ large, which is there is an actual discussion of the commission denying permits. And in this context in wildlife, but also for a whole host of other reasons. And again, that's a new, really new emphasis based on this updated mission of regulating oil and gas, the whole concept that you can say no for good reasons. Again, it already states too that Colorado Parks and Wildlife can make recommendations on the conditions for which approval will happen. And right now the regulations go far as to say, if the director's recommendation doesn't include the conditions that Colorado Parks and Wildlife said should apply to protect wildlife, then as part of talking to the commission, the director has to explain why. In other words, not just saying you can ignore those because we don't feel like it, but here's why I think you can still approve these permits or this plan without the recommended conditions that Colorado Parks and Wildlife submitted. That's really helpful. What's missing and what we're recommending is that when making that recommendation, the director not only has to explain why they disagree, why he or she disagrees, but why those conditions, without the conditions, the development would still adequately protect wildlife, would still try to avoid, minimize, or mitigate the negative impacts. And we would also add that if Colorado Parks and Wildlife goes to that level of saying you should deny this development altogether, and the director doesn't follow that recommendation, there should also be an explicit inclusion of that in what the director provides to the commission. Because again, we're in this kind of game of telephone, right? Of CPW talks to the director talks to the commission. We're trying to make sure that that consultation, that input is as clear as possible. So again, if CPW goes so far as to say this can't be done in a way that can sufficiently address risk to wildlife, we want to make sure that that information and the reason that the COGCC director doesn't think that's right is included. So the next concept I wanted to talk about is high priority habitat. Bob mentioned that in the previous rules, we had two different concepts. We had sensitive wildlife habitat areas and restricted surface occupancy areas, both of which sound very inspiring. And what's happened in this process is it's been consolidated into one concept called high priority habitat. And so the way that high priority habitat looks, if you were to go into Rule 1202, is it's a list of specific species, a lot of birds, obviously, raptors, and also big game, and actually going so far as to looking at riparian areas, so areas to protect trout, but also just use of important water areas. And this, I'm calling it the definitive list because this is what triggers all those other obligations we were just talking about to protect wildlife. So if you're going to look at alternate locations, you would look at those alternative locations if you're impacting high priority habitat. similarly the cumulative impacts that are being addressed. What is the, taking into account all the impacts of what's already happening in habitat and how new development could affect it and really push it over the top. That again is going to be centered on what is high priority habitat. So the way that the process works is there are certain species, certain resources identified, and then there are no-go areas, which are similar to restricted surface occupancy. So buffers around certain types of high priority habitat, no-go areas, I would call them. And then for additional areas and additional species and resources, there has to be an approved plan for how to avoid and address harm if the density of oil and gas location would be more than 1 per square mile in that habitat. So we have 2 options, which is similar to how the rules worked before, but 1 concept and 1 list. Right now, if you go into Rule 1202, you'll see a pretty long list. You'll be shocked to hear that most of us think that list might need to be a little longer. But one of the complications here is that there isn't a definition or a process set out for how the high priority habitat list will be shared, how it will be updated, how there can be input, because CPW has explained that this list is based on where they have enough data to identify the location of species or their habitat, and where they know what the most useful protective measures would be. In other words, how much of a buffer should there be? So of course, as we have more science, more data, we know where more species are, we want to be able to share our wisdom and have other scientists share their wisdom and make sure that there's a process for explaining how these buffers and other measures are defined and how they get updated, and that should be a transparent process. Right now, that's just missing. So that's something we really feel needs to be improved. Then, as I mentioned, there are species that really deserve protective buffers that are larger than those in here. For instance, right now, there's a 1 mile no-go area around greater sage grouse flex, and there really should be 2 miles. And same for the Gunnison sage grouse. Right now, it's about 6/10 of a mile, and it should be a mile. And for golden eagles, we're seeing only a 1/4 mile buffers around nests, and really the science tells us it should be closer to 1/2 mile. We see the same things with riparian areas, streams. There are categories in there that are missing altogether as like a general concept that areas on the banks of waters and streams are important for wildlife and should be protected. Instead, we have a variety of different types of areas that are protected, and the protections are not generally as large as we think they should be. We think they should be closer to a 1/4 mile, and what we're seeing right now is 300 feet, which if you think about how close that is when there's a spill or some other issue, it's something where, again, we want to see it improved. And finally, Governor Polis last year issued an executive order for protecting big game migration corridors and winter habitat. Right now, most of those species only appear in the 2nd category. They don't appear in the no-go areas at all. So we think there really needs to be some strengthening of protection for the migration corridors, as well as there are species missing, such as moose and white-tailed deer. So again, the definitive list has to be a little more definitive. Next concept is biological resources. And Bob mentioned this too. This is the first time we're seeing this. The Senate bill actually includes in the requirements that the Commission shall protect against adverse environmental impacts on any air, water, soil, or biological resource that comes from oil and gas. It's also, the term biological resources also shows up when looking at the criteria that the Commission should use for approving or denying operations. But mysteriously, the term itself is not defined, and it's not included in triggers for consultation by a CPW or in the compensatory mitigation or cumulative impacts or alternative locations. So again, going back to our definitive list idea, this resource is missing in action. In our collective thoughts, the term could be broader and should really look at things like plants and plant communities, invertebrate species, pollinators, and soils. And so we're seeking to see that incorporated throughout. And the real distinction here that we're hearing is the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission's, Conservation Commission staff right now believe that even though biological resources is used in the statute and in the regulations somewhat, they can just assume that would be covered by protecting wildlife because there are plants within wildlife habitat, hard to argue with that one, true, and soil, etc. So if you're protecting wildlife habitat, you're getting at all the other elements of biological resources and it should just be considered covered. So I think that's a really important difference of opinion. We've been arguing that if this wasn't supposed to be its own term, if it wasn't supposed to be protected, we wouldn't see the term in the statute, we wouldn't see it coming up. So we're proposing that there be a definition and that it be included, and that also consultation be expanded to not just include Colorado Parks and Wildlife, but also the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, which really keeps track of a lot of what you would think of as biological resources if you try to separate those from wild. So we'd like to rescue that from being missing in action. And the last one I wanted to hit on is compensatory mitigation. Bob hit on this a little bit, but this gets into the concept of mitigation, which we talk about the hierarchy. And the hierarchy means you do the most effective thing first. And so the first thing in the hierarchy is to avoid the impact, to avoid the harm. You know you have successfully avoided harm if you're avoiding harm. The next on the hierarchy would be minimization. In other words, what can you do to really lessen the impact of the oil and gas development on wildlife resources? So relocating operations would be an example of that. So the last resort is once we get to impacts we can't sufficiently avoid or minimize, we kind of have this last resort of you can compensate for the harm. Obviously, that is the last resort because it's the least effective. Compensatory mitigation, addresses those unavoidable adverse direct and indirect impacts. So that was a helpful approach in the regulations as they are. Direct impacts is the direct loss of habitat. Indirect could, for instance, include the overall fragmentation of habitat. Right now, the regulations provide that you can pay a fee or you can develop a project to complete your compensatory mitigation for direct or indirect impacts. And that exceptions to this requirement are granted only after consulting with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. Those are all really helpful things. We'd like to put some more parameters on this because again, this is the last resort. We want to confirm that Colorado Parks and Wildlife has been able to say, look, all the avoidance and minimization that could be required has been required. So these are truly unavoidable impacts. We don't really want this to be used as in, we'd rather just write a check than try to actually do what we know will be successful. And then again, wanting more definition on the fees. Right now there's a set fee between $11,000 and $12,000, I think it is, for habitat disturbances that are what they would assume is about a well. So less than 11 acres, I think. And after that, it's up to CPW to make recommendations and up to COGCC to approve it. And again, if there's going to be an exception, we would like that to be explained as to why the mitigation is not needed. But more importantly, I think, is this definition on how the fees are being calculated and where they're being spent if there's going to be a fee option. And for projects, we really want to make sure that the work that's being done is additional. In other words, it's additive to what's being done. It's durable. It's going to exist for as long as the impacts are existing from oil and gas development. It's certain, it's reliable. We know it's going to work as much as possible. We can quantify it, and it's as timely as possible to compensate for the loss of habitat. So it's a tricky thing. This is an important addition because what we're talking about is issuing permits on existing leases. So there is going to be pressure to issue those permits. And we're trying to find that right balance between having this tool in the toolbox and making sure it's only used as a last resort. And when it's used, it's doing what it's supposed to. one thing that was added in the statute that's really helpful here is previously it wasn't clear that Colorado Parks and Wildlife and COGCC could require compensatory mitigation without the approval of the surface owner, the landowner. Now it's very clear that it can be required regardless of that consent, which makes perfect sense because compensatory mitigation is not happening on their property. So if we've gotten to the point of unavoidable impacts, that can go forward now to have compensatory mitigation and address those impacts, which we did not have that tool in the toolbox before. So really helpful, but again, improvements. And finally, just to set us up for the next, because we're going to do questions at the end, but to me, and of course, that's my viewpoint, these species have a lot of questions. And we really just want to, I think, reiterate that for you, that there are questions right now with the regulations of, you know, how do we know that the protections are going to be put in place? How do we know that CPW will get a chance to engage, that we'll get a chance to engage, that the right science is being used, that we're not in a just trust us situation. So what we're looking at is how do we identify those needs for more certainty, and how do we make sure that the right activities happen at the right time, and that, you know, the right entities are developing. So that's what this group is asking for our help, I think, and I'm hoping we can all do that. And now I'm going to turn it over to Bo Kiklis, who is the public lands advocate with Conservation Colorado, and he's going to talk a little bit more about advocacy.
Awesome. Thanks, Nita, and thanks, Bob, really for sharing all that really great information. I hope attendees found that as useful as I did. I've been seeing a lot of questions come into the comment box, so definitely keep those coming. Did want to provide a few action items for folks and kind of just provide a recap of kind of what the big priorities are from here. But I guess before we do that, just to put a point of emphasis on this work and really to acknowledge and recognize that opportunities to protect wildlife at this level don't come around too often. And when they do, we really have to capitalize on them, because these have lasting impacts. We have to take advantage of these opportunities when they're presented to us. So a few ways you can help out, and I guess before I do that, just in summary, from all that Nita and Bob have shared, there's really these 5 key areas that we've identified, and those are available in the 3-page fact sheet and comment guide that should be available to you. And if it's not, you can definitely access that by reaching out to the organization that you registered for this webinar through. That information can be made available to you. But basically, what this boils down to, right, is we need to see protections provided for wildlife in order to fulfill this new mission of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. So that means providing protections that go down to the species specific level. So a couple of species were named there specifically, right? Like, for example, we need protections that go down to the level of protecting the sage grouse. We need to see increased protections in riparian areas that provide critical fish and wildlife habitat. Our big game migration corridors that our big game relies so heavily on year in, year out, those areas need to be adequately protected. As it relates to compensatory mitigation, we have to have adequate measures in place to ensure that those mitigation efforts are effective and actually offsetting the impacts from oil and gas on wildlife. And lastly, we need to ensure that biological resources are actually protected against the adverse impacts of oil and gas and included in these new rules. So again, that information obviously has been presented on by Nita and Bob here this evening, but can be made available through that 3-pager. And again, don't hesitate to reach out, and we can see that you have that information on hand. So in terms of how you all can help tonight, it's awesome to see so many folks tuned in that are interested in this topic. I think there's a number of things that we're going to try to distill this down into what we think are the most immediate action items. I think first and foremost is the COGCC, as this is a rulemaking, is accepting public comment in written format on these rules. So this is something where you can take what you learned this evening, write it up in a comment, and ship that off to the COGCC to go on the record I think oftentimes we sometimes feel like, hey, like, is my comment really going to have that much of an impact? I think in this rulemaking in particular, it will have a significant impact. We've heard that from the Cogcc directly that they're reading each comment carefully and taking that stuff in. And if they're particularly receiving stuff from you all, that goes a really long ways. So those comments are great. Be sure to get those in, and we're happy to work with you on guidance in crafting that. I think similarly to that, right, is you're going through the exercise of writing a comment. You could also take that same comment, maybe spruce it up a little bit and make it a little bit more friendly for a submission to your local paper as a letter to the editor. Again, these are really incredibly powerful tools that can help us influence decision makers like the commissioners. Again, it may not seem like a lot when it runs in the paper and you may question who's actually reading it, but rest assured that those decision makers are looking closely at those pieces, and they go a long way in terms of how we drive the larger narrative and influence folks that have the power to make these decisions. I think another really big one, right, is as we approach the actual rulemaking hearing dates, is there's going to be opportunity for you to show up on all likelihood virtually to provide verbal testimony or verbal comment directly in front of the commission. Again, that is an incredibly impactful tactic, and has the ability to sway votes and positions the day of the hearing or the days thereafter when they go to make their votes on the rules. So again, like, we'll be looking for a lot of support in terms of hearing participation and turnout. So please let us know if you're interested in participating in that regard. And I think the last thing I'll say, and I tend to think this is maybe the most important of all the things that you can do, but it's go organize your friends and family. Go talk to your friends, talk to your hunting buddies, your fishing buddies, your friends that you go birding with, somebody who's a wildlife enthusiast, or people that are just generally interested in this topic. Get them to write a comment, bring them out to a hearing to testify, help them write a letter to the editor, get them involved, right? Our strength is in our numbers, and how now have the tools and resources from this webinar and from being connected to all these great organizations that have put on this webinar tonight to go and have that impact and help us multiply and get these strong rules in place so we can bring greater protections for wildlife in Colorado. So I think we're going to turn to Q&A. So Dolly, I don't know if you want to take it from here, but again, really, really grateful for everyone that's tuned in tonight, and looking forward to working with you all and making some progress here.
Great, thank you, Bo. So as a reminder, we have been getting a whole bunch of really, really great questions. But if you haven't asked a question yet and you want to, you can do so either via our Zoom chat box or through the comment section on Facebook Live. I did want to flag for folks that we will be circulating, especially if you registered for this webinar through Zoom. We will be following up with all registrants, and also whichever organization you found out about this webinar through, we'll also be sharing a 3-page fact sheet because there's been lots of questions about how can we get this information to you, since you're kind of drinking from a fire hose tonight. We want to make sure that it is in a digestible manner. I do want to flag also at the top of your screen is the Cogcc's Mission Change Rulemaking webpage. Feel free to take a look at that and familiarize yourself with that. But again, we will be following up with material. And if you want to be on the safe side and make sure you get that material, please do put your first and last name and email address in the chat box or the comment section if you're on Facebook, and we'll make sure that we follow up with you. All right, we're going to go ahead and start with the questions. Again, Ian and I are going to be tag teaming this. So the very first question is for Nada. Nada, can you please explain a bit more about what compensatory mitigation is, including providing some examples? And before you answer that, I will go ahead and say, why don't we turn this screen off for now? And that way participants can see everyone's faces. Nada? Again, the question was, explain a bit more about what compensatory mitigation is and include examples if able.
Sure. So Compensatory mitigation is really the idea that once you can no longer avoid harm, and you are going to be permitted to still go forward with such activity that will cause the harm, you can compensate for that loss. And obviously there's not true compensation in that you can't make the oil and gas well pad go away as soon as it's created. So really it's helpful to think of it also as off-site compensation or mitigation. So it's away from the actual harm that's being permitted. And examples would be, for instance, you've harmed greater sage-grouse habitat in one place, you could go and restore greater sage-grouse habitat of an equal or greater amount in another area. Generally, because as we talked about, compensatory mitigation is supposed to be durable, be additive, be certain as much as possible, you'll often see compensatory mitigation is not one-to-one. In other words, I've destroyed 1 acre of habitat, I'm going to just create another. Because there is a lack of certainty, we usually see compensatory mitigation projects addressing bigger areas. So those would be some of the examples. When we have a fund option, then it gets a little more complicated. So when you have a smaller disturbance, it's very hard to go out and buy 8 acres of habitat and restore them. So for some of the smaller impacts, we'll often see an agency create a fund, which is something that CPW and Cogcc have included in these regulations. In that case, the fund itself could be giving money to restore projects. And in Colorado, we have a Colorado Habitat Exchange, which is starting to get up and running, and that would be a similar concept. The funds could go into the exchange to purchase protections or restoration.
Thank you. Ian, you're the next one up to ask the question.
All right, we have a great question here from Sally for either Bob or Nada. But she asks, since Senate Bill 181 has protection sections and eliminates constraints on wildlife protection, does that cover what we could lose if, with the changes proposed to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act proposed by the Trump administration? In other words, does it address an incidental take?
Do you want to start, Bob, or do you want me to start?
Well, I think in general, the state is able to, the state has jurisdiction over wildlife, and the protections that will be included in the Cogcc's rules would apply to activities in Colorado, notwithstanding any changes to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. That's my sense. And Nada, if there's a finer point to that, please chime in.
I think the finer point gets down to the high priority habitat list, in that the Migratory Bird Treaty Act applies to all migrating birds. And then we have the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act that apply to those species. But right now, our oil and gas rules are really focused on high priority habitat. So to the extent migrating birds are not covered, Colorado Parks and Wildlife would still have flexibility to identify and propose measures to address that harm. But it's not actually quite as clear, but I think they could.
Great, thank you. The next question is from John. He asks, is wildlife defined in the statutes, and how might it be different from biological resources if we succeed in getting the latter term defined in the rules?
I might take a shot at that. So wildlife is defined to include any of the state's wildlife species and their habitats. And I guess specifically I'm referring to the definition of wildlife resources that the Cogcc has adopted. Again, the Cogcc hasn't proposed a definition of biological resources, so it's not entirely clear how those would differ. As Nada said, a few of the concepts that we've considered with regard to biological resources include plant species, soils, invertebrates, some things that are sort of different than what we think of when we think of wildlife. So it would be additive in my view.
Thank you.
Great, and I have a question here for either of you, but Cade asks, is there any kind of data, and I think a few other people have asked similar questions, any kind of data to show how often the recommendations from CPW have been actually put into effect by the commission? And I think kind of to incorporate some other questions, just like if you guys could expand a little bit about that, that collaboration between CPW and the COGCC going forward.
Okay, I'll take a shot at that. I think it has worked in a lot of places and it has not worked in a lot of places. It becomes harder when the proposal from Parks and Wildlife is to move a pad to a location that might not be acceptable to a surface owner. The statute, as it stood before Senate Bill 181, would give the surface owner the ability to to not consent to moving a pad that, again, she or he didn't like, or to a location that they didn't like. I think it's more likely that measures that go to how operations might occur in a place that, that the surface owner and the operator have agreed to, that those would be more likely to be included, such as timing restrictions, such as operational practices that would minimize impacts on wildlife. I think my sense is that we've seen more of those incorporated into permits as a result of CPW's consultation and suggestion. And it gets harder, just frankly, it gets harder when the ask to protect wildlife is more consequential to both the operator and to the surface owner.
Okay, we have another question here from Barbara. For either one of you all, how will mitigation be administered, and who decides where and for how long? And finally, who monitors the mitigation?
I can start, and then Bob, maybe you can help with the last part of that, since you've been more on the ground with it, obviously. Right now, it's set up that the plan would be proposed by an operator and it would be reviewed by Colorado Parks and Wildlife and the commission. And the final decision to accept the plan would be with the commission itself. But that's, that's again why we're trying to make those standards as strong as possible for what the plans must accomplish and who reviews them, and kind of getting into a little more detail there. Monitoring could and should certainly be built into a compensatory mitigation or wildlife mitigation plan for exactly the reason you're, I think, implying, which is sometimes we think we have a really great idea of how to mitigate effectively and it doesn't work. So certainly that can be built into the plan of, if this doesn't work, here's what happens, or the mitigation will be deemed successful once these conditions are met, once certain amounts of habitat has been restored by looking at certain plants. That can all be worked into a plan.
Thank you.
The only thing that I might add to that is the draft rules that the commission's put out contemplate a set fee for disturbances up to 11 acres, and Nada covered that in her section. One of our interests is in making sure that that amount is set at a level that's sufficient to ensure long-term monitoring and maintenance of the mitigation projects, and for the durability and additive qualities that, again, Nada kind of flagged is the whole purpose of the mitigation.
And I should say the fee is $13,750. Just so we can be accurate on the fee.
Great. I have a clarifying question here on something you were talking about, Nada. But Karen asks, what does the density of oil and gas locations exceeds 1 per square mile mean? She's wondering if that's by ownership, by well, etc.
Bob, if you want to clarify how you use this, it's generally looking at the amount of land that's been disturbed, and it's looking at one infrastructure area at a time. So a well and the well pad and the other disturbance that's associated with that effort. If it's a plan for more than one well pad, I think they would look at that all together. Too. Is that right? Any differences?
Question we have is what are the considerations for plant species? Will native plant materials be required for reclamation and or restoration?
So I'll just say that the consideration of plant species and the permitting is one of the sort of key concepts behind our request that the agency address biological resources through this rulemaking as part of the mission change. The Oil and Gas Commission has separate rules as to reclamation and the requirement that an operator identify a reference area before they start disturbing the ground, that they will reclaim to that reference area standard. There are many who feel like those rules need to be brought up to date also, so that those reference areas and the reclamationers are more effective at restoring the values that might be lost when a site is initially constructed. But those reclamation rules are not part of the mission change rulemaking that's underway right now.
And I believe, let's see, we have a question is, when there is a spill or accident related to oil and gas development activities, whether in development or in operations phases, how is that handled now? And might that be changed at all in this rulemaking process?
I'll touch on that. The Oil and Gas Commission's rules today require operators to report spills, and I don't remember off the top of my head the sort of quantity threshold that's required to be reported. It was changed legislatively a couple of years ago, and so it's actually, any spill, even quite small ones, need to be reported. Spills that reach surface waters, there's a requirement that those be reported more quickly than a spill in a dryland agricultural operation, for example. So the reporting requirements for spills depend on the values that might be impacted by them. And then separate rules of the commission require those spills to be cleaned up and to develop a plan to do so, and that plan has to get approved by the commission.
Great. All right, I have a question here from Gabrielle. She asks, where are the opportunities for public and or expert input during the proposed Cogcc permitting process? So is there an opportunity for other people and other groups outside of the examples of CPW that we've given to be involved, to share their expertise? And do you think these opportunities are sufficient, or do you see places where we could improve public input?
Do you want me to take that, Nada?
I can start. And,
okay, great.
We can go from there. Right now, and that's, gets back to what we were talking about with trying to incorporate more opportunities for public input into the identification of high priority habitat. But yes, right now, there are more opportunities for public input than there were before in terms of approval of an oil and gas development plan, which addresses all the ways they would avoid or compensate for harm to wildlife. I think when we get into the nitty gritty of it, we've tried to look for additional opportunities where another round, for instance, of public oversight may be specific to changes that are made after public input, or opportunities for the public to have a chance to weigh in after Colorado Parks and Wildlife, so we'd have the benefit of their input too. So those are some of the things we've looked at, but there are opportunities now in these rules to comment before the commission approves the oil and gas development plan. And the plan would incorporate not just the ways that the operator would be addressing wildlife, but all the other resources that are being addressed. So that gets into air and water and safety and all sorts of other important things.
The one thing that I might add, I think part of the question was, what are some of the challenges to public comment or public participation? My sense is that one of the most challenging things about public comment on drilling permits or location permits is just the volume of material that's available on the Cogcc's website. that if you go to the pending permits because you might want to comment on something, it's hard to figure out which ones are up and what the concerns might be. Our hope really is that, especially for locations that are in high priority habitat and that trigger consultation with Parks and Wildlife, that those will be easier to identify, so that people can make their concerns known, maybe communicate with CPW to share their concerns and kind of vet those through the expert agencies too.
I would like to flag that it is 7 o'clock, so it's the top of the hour. However, both Nada and Bob were kind enough to say they'd give us a little bit extra time. So we're going to extend it for another 10 minutes just because we have such good questions left. So if you have to get off the line, we appreciate that, and we'll be following up with everybody. But let's go ahead to the next question. And that is, this is for either Nada or Bob. How does CPW consultation and Cogcc rules mesh with federal public land management stipulation requirements?
I'll start and Bob can talk about how he's seen it go in the past as well. There are provisions in the rules for CPW to waive adding more conditions or doing a separate approval for a plan if the well and other activities are proposed on federal land. So in that situation, the federal protections, the federal stipulations and conditions of approval can just be adopted as sufficient. And that we see that happen very often. And sometimes if wells are, it's for the state, they get a chance to weigh in to say if it should be more protective. But there is flexibility to adopt the plans as written and not go through a whole new process.
And the only thing that I might add is that Parks and Wildlife is typically invited to the on-site inspection that is required under the federal rules and onshore order number 1. And in theory anyway, that's the opportunity to bring the state's perspective on wildlife protection to the conversation in the federal permitting process, just because the federal permit it takes longer to get, so operators generally would go for that first. And so there's been an MOU in place that allows CPW to attend those and raise wildlife concerns in the federal permitting process so that they don't have to fight about it when the company comes to get its state permit later.
Great. Well, I have a question. I'm going to direct it at Bo first, but I would imagine all three of you have something to say about it. But I think it speaks a lot to what Bo was talking to about how we can all get involved. And Sam asks, how likely is it that the Cogcc will adopt these proposals? And who's going to be evaluating the potential impacts to wildlife and habitat on the landscape, as well as kind of what are the changes? We've been working on Senate Bill 181 for over a year now, the implementation of it. So what are the changes to now that we have a newly appointed professional commission?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in with the first stab there, and then obviously Nate and Bob, feel free to backfill anything here. I think so far, Sam, to answer your question, we've seen some progress with the draft rules at this point. But recognize that also that there's more opportunity to continue to influence those rules, right? So some of these areas where NADA has identified areas for improvement, those are places we can definitely be pushing hard on and continue to be pushing hard on to make more significant progress. I think difficult to say with any certainty as to what the final product remains to be, but the best thing that we can do is focus on this webinar and involve with these organizations is to show up and make our voices heard and try to influence the process to the best of our ability.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Bo. So thanks for that. I will just flag that the professional commission. So in the past, it's been a 9-person volunteer commission appointed by the governor. Now it's a 5-person professional commission, meaning that they're full-time state employees. I think it's a great opportunity to they will have more time to dig into the details on this, and will, I think, be susceptible to compelling arguments that are fact-based and expert-supported through the rulemaking, to really consider the wildlife protections that we're talking about here.
So this question relates to birding. And the question is there any aspect of this rulemaking that can help protect grassland breeding species, specifically mountain plover, prairie chickens, etc., from all the development that has already happened in Weld County and the rest of eastern Colorado? Can compensation, and so specifically the question is, can compensation for one new impact be used to address an impact from a past oil and gas development effort?
Yeah, so a lot of those species are in the high priority habitat section. So that's helpful in that theoretically that means the impacts will be quantified and addressed. And once again, I think as we mentioned, Colorado Parks and Wildlife has the discretion to address species that aren't called out already in high priority habitat if they're identifying something to do to protect. So certainly new development would comply with this, but yeah, I think that's exactly an opportunity for compensatory mitigation if we're going to approve new developments in the habitat for those grassland breeding birds. One of the compensatory mitigation efforts could be to restore and ensure protective management of habitat that's been harmed in the past. That would be something that would be right exactly in the line of the type of compensatory mitigation we'd hope to see CPW approving as a project or using the fees to do.
Thank you.
Great. I have a great question here from Abby on a bit more of the science. So she starts off by thanking all of you for all the work that you've done on this. But the question is, riparian corridors are critical habitat for birds and other wildlife, as well as provide critical ecological services and functions. Could you talk a bit to the science or references used to determine the quarter-mile setback for riparian areas, and how was this distance determined adequate?
So maybe I'll start. It's our sense that a 300-foot buffer is inadequate to really protect all of the values that might be associated with riparian areas. That 300 feet might be sufficient to address impacts from erosion, such as sedimentation, to keep that from reaching the stream in a stormwater event or something else. But that, the risk of impacts on the stream from spills can't be addressed with a 300-foot setback. You need a larger buffer around streams to protect it against the possibility of spills. And so that's where the quarter mile came from. The basis for that is, I think, at least in part, the existence of a similar buffer in the existing rules around streams that provide drinking water for people, where certain operational practices are required the closer that you get to a stream, and then there's kind of a no-go zone, as Nada had described, one of the aspects of high priority habitat. So that's kind of the basis of the quarter mile was, erosion can be prevented close in, but then the possibility of spills impacting streams requires a buffer that's larger than the 300 feet.
I have a question about residential or commercial developments. Are they required to be more sensitive to these wildlife protection constraints?
That's not really addressed in the oil and gas rulemaking in terms of how, what's addressed in the rulemakings is how oil and gas could affect other developments and other species. So they're not really in these rules getting at how residential or commercial developments should be conducted to protect wildlife. But they should, of course. This is a pretty narrow rulemaking, even though it's addressing so many aspects of oil and gas development, but it's only focused on that use.
All right, I have a great question here from Barbara, And she asks, is there any detail in the draft rules that defines what the requirements will be for reclamation? Will reclamation require a functioning ecosystem, or what will it require?
So the proposed rules do not address or don't seek to modify the existing reclamation rules of the Cogcc. And again, the current rules are pretty narrow, where a company really just has to meet the vegetation standards that are present in a reference area when they go to reclaim a site. And it doesn't go to the broader values that might be implicated or the ecosystem function that the pad would otherwise serve. So that's not being addressed in this rulemaking. You know, I would say that's, pardon the pun, but sort of fertile ground for a future rulemaking to urge the commission to modify its reclamation rules in light of the new mission and the need to protect wildlife.
And I think the only way we get at it here is if, as we discussed in answer to a previous question, the compensatory mitigation is to reclaim or restore other habitat to function. Then we could get at it that way. But otherwise, we're going to be using the reclamation standards we currently have.
Great. Well, recognizing that we're 10 past the hour, I think we can start to wrap up. I guess Dana and Bob, maybe some final thoughts on what you maybe are most encouraged by so far in the rulemaking, and any closing words for folks.
I guess I'm encouraged that TPW had so many opportunities to be heard. And that really has elevated the role of wildlife in this process in a way that it really hasn't been before. So having a whole section of rules updated that were updated, in the world of rulemaking so recently, well, 2008 seems very long ago to all of us in terms of science and development and things. I think for this agency to be doing a full revision of these rules, the 1200 series right now, is encouraging. And the more information we provide, the more we push, the more likely we are to, make the most of that opportunity.
I'll just share that I'm encouraged by the evolution that we've seen in oversight of oil and gas generally. As Nada said, the rulemaking in 2008 that involved wildlife issues for the first time was significant, but kind of a baby step, and didn't even contemplate things like compensatory mitigation, and considered riparian setbacks, but kind of put those aside because it was a little too much at the time. And here we are having those conversations now in a venue that I think is open to having those. I think the legislative direction in Senate Bill 181 was clear that the agency has an obligation to protect wildlife. And so some of the headwind maybe that the Cogcc ran into in the past has been ameliorated just again by evolution and growth, but also growth and the evolution of thinking, but also by this new bold direction from the legislature and Governor Polis to protect wildlife when it comes to oil and gas. So I find that encouraging.
All right. Well, thanks everyone so much for taking the time to join us this evening. Really appreciate your participation, all the great questions. We'll be following back up. There is a recording of this that will be available, and we'll also, for those that didn't get the 3-page document, please drop your name and email in the chat box. We can make sure you get that. And of course, a lot of organizations involved in this with really incredible resources and information. So please feel free to reach out to us, and we're looking forward to working with you on this rulemaking.
Thanks, everybody.
Yes.
And please note that there is a note, my email address is in the chat box if there are additional needs that come from it. And I can be sure to relay it to Bo or Ian, Bob or Nada, or all our other partners that are working so hard on this issue. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.